The reception must end before it begins. Bess Tuckett spoke from behind Harriet with such care that the words became more alarming, not less. Beyond the dressing-room door, Redbourne House had already begun to glow for the evening. 300 candles burned across the principal rooms. Hothouse lilies stood in porcelain urns beneath the family portraits. Musicians tuned their instruments in the ballroom, while footmen carried silver trays through passages scented with beeswax, flowers, and roasting meats. It was Tuesday, the 4th of May, 1858, and Harriet Dorrington was meant to receive London for the first time as Duchess of Redbourne. Instead, she studied Bess's face in the mirror. Who said that? His Grace, your Grace. He has asked to speak with you before you go down. Harriet did not turn at once. Bess held the old tortoise-shell comb in one hand. It had belonged to Harriet's mother and had been missing one tooth for as long as Harriet could remember. "Put it in," Harriet said, "not the diamond pins. The comb has never failed me." Bess slid it carefully into the dark arrangement of Harriet's hair. The damaged edge disappeared beneath the smooth coils, yet the comb held firm. Harriet had just fastened one glove when Arthur entered without waiting to be announced. He wore evening black, but he had not put on his gloves. That omission disturbed her more than haste would have done. Arthur Dorrington never appeared unfinished before a room he intended to command. "Bess," he said, "leave us." Harriet met his eyes in the mirror. "Bess may remain until my necklace is secured." Arthur's gaze moved briefly to the diamond riviere at her throat. "It will not be worn tonight." Bess's hands went still. Harriet turned on the stool. "Why?" Arthur closed the door. He did it gently. "A private bank in which I held substantial funds has failed. Several speculative calls were made against investments that cannot now be met without liquidating. Nearly everything not protected by entail." Harriet heard the meaning before she understood the shape of it. The title remained, Redbourne remained. The land remained bound to the succession, but the money that kept the London house operating, the carriages moving, the servants paid, and the political machine fed had vanished. "How much?" she asked. "Enough that Redbourne House cannot continue as it has." "For how long?" "I don't know." His answer was smooth, but he watched her too closely. Harriet saw it then, not merely worry, expectation. He was waiting to discover which loss would reach her first. "The musicians," she said. Arthur's expression altered. "What of them?" "They were engaged for the night. Are they paid?" "They will be." "The temporary footmen?" "Their wages are contracted." "The florist?" "The confectioner?" "The men who delivered the extra glassware?" "Harriet, have they been paid?" "Not yet. The accounts were to be settled tomorrow." She rose. "Then they must be settled tonight." He studied her as if she had answered a question he had not spoken correctly. "You haven't asked about your allowance." "It can wait." "Your gowns?" "They can wait." "The second carriage?" "It can go." Harriet reached behind her neck for the clasp of the riviere. "But men who accepted work in good faith will not carry our disgrace into their own homes." The clasp caught in a strand of hair. Bess stepped forward, but Arthur was nearer. "Allow me." Harriet lowered her hands. Arthur moved behind her. In the mirror, his face appeared above hers, composed and unreadable. His fingers found the clasp. One brushed the skin at the back of her neck, light enough to be accidental and warm enough to make her breath change. Arthur felt it. His gaze met hers in the glass. For a suspended moment, neither of them moved. The air between them held the intimacy of 6 months of marriage and the distance of 6 months out a declaration either had dared to make Then Arthur freed the strand and withdrew his hand. The riviere loosened into Harriet's palms. "Thank you," she said. "It belongs in the Redbourne vault," Arthur replied. "Not because it must be sold? No." The answer came too quickly. Harriet looked at him. "Then not everything is lost. No, the title, the entailed estates, and certain settled property remain. But the household must close. Most of it. How soon? Within the week." Bess drew a quiet breath. Harriet did not look toward her. "Does Mrs. Ellison know?" "Not yet." "Then she hears it from us before the servants hear it from rumor." Arthur's brows lifted slightly. You're the Duke. I'm the Duchess. Ruin doesn't release either of us from responsibility. Something moved in his face, too swift to name. Harriet placed the Riviere in its case and closed the lid. "The reception will not be cancelled. Harriet, we cannot afford extravagance. The extravagance has already been ordered, delivered, and prepared. Cancelling now would save little and humiliate everyone who came to serve this house tonight. We receive for 1 hour. No second opening of wine, no additional courses. The musicians are dismissed with full payment after the first set. The temporary servants are paid before midnight. Tomorrow we begin reductions." Arthur was silent long enough that Bess glanced between them. "You've decided this quickly," he said. "Someone must. And if society asks why the evening ended early, we say there has been an urgent family matter. That is not the truth." Harriet held his gaze. "Then tell me what truth you prefer." The challenge landed between them. Arthur could have ended everything in that moment. The memorandum lay signed in the solicitor's keeping. The bank had not ruined him. The calls had been staged, the losses contained, the fear manufactured to answer one question he had never had the courage to ask his wife directly. Would she remain if comfort vanished? Harriet stood before him without diamonds, already protecting people she could have dismissed. And still he did not confess. "An urgent financial matter," he said. Harriet gave a small nod. "That will do." 1 hour later, Redbourne House glittered as though nothing had changed. Harriet descended the staircase with Arthur beside her, the old comb hidden in her hair and no necklace at her throat. Guests noticed the absence of diamonds. They noticed Arthur's unusual restraint. They noticed Lady Maud Dorrington stationed near the ballroom doors, as if the house still moved according to her hand. Harriet greeted every guest without false gaiety and without visible fear. When the first set ended, Arthur stepped forward and announced that an urgent family matter required the evening to close early. He thanked the musicians personally. Harriet spoke with the temporary servants' supervisor and ordered payment made before anyone left. The room filled with disappointed whispers, but no one was permitted to say. The Redbournes had failed to honor an obligation. Lady Maud approached Harriet as the last guests collected their cloaks. "You bear inconvenience well," she said. "I have had only an hour's practice. A modest beginning can look very dignified beneath chandeliers." Harriet smiled. "Dignity usually survives the removal of furniture." Maud's eyes sharpened. "We shall see." Arthur heard the exchange. "My aunt offers comfort badly," he said. "It is one of her oldest accomplishments." Maud looked at him. "And your wife answers quickly. That is newer." "Then you should take care not to give her practice." Arthur's tone was mild, but the rebuke was public enough to end the conversation. Harriet looked at him with brief surprise. He had protected her. Yet she could not shake the sense that he was also observing what his protection produced. After midnight, when the musicians and temporary servants had been paid, Harriet went to speak with Mrs. Ellison. Arthur remained in the darkened ballroom with Lady Maud, candles guttered above the empty floor. She did not ask for money, Maud said. No, she did not threaten to leave. No, she won the servants before they knew there was a contest. Arthur's jaw tightened. There is no contest. There is always a contest when a new duchess enters a political house managed for years by someone else. Maud folded her fan. She will replace me if you let her. Perhaps the household should belong to its mistress. And perhaps a woman who behaves nobly for one evening will behave differently when comfort becomes truly private. Arthur looked toward the doorway through which Harriet had disappeared. She believes me. That is why the test has value, or why it should end. Maud's gaze held his. Not yet. Let the reductions become real enough to reach her habits. Let her choose when no one is watching. Harriet returned before Arthur answered. She had removed her gloves. Fatigue showed around her eyes, but her posture remained straight. Mrs. Ellison will prepare a full staff account by morning, she said. No dismissal without wages and a proper character. Arthur nodded. Agreed. Harriet studied him for one quiet moment. Thank you for telling me the truth before I went down. There it was again, the open door he had already refused once. Arthur felt the confession rise, sharp and necessary. He saw the old comb holding firm in her hair. He saw the trust in her face. Then fear, older than their marriage, closed its hand around him. You deserve to know, he said. Harriet accepted the lie as honor. Arthur watched her leave the ballroom and understood, with a clarity that offered no mercy, that 1 hour of deception had already become something more dangerous. By Wednesday morning, Harriet had cancelled 3 gowns, the second carriage, an order for ornamental silver, and every improvement planned for the winter conservatory. Yet the list before her still seemed less severe than the faces waiting beyond the morning-room door. Mrs. Ellison had prepared a full account of the London household before breakfast. Some servants could return to Redbourne properties in the country. Others would require new places. All would need wages, references, and enough money to travel without humiliation. Harriet read every name twice. The younger footman must not be dismissed without written characters, she said. And Mrs. Bell has a widowed sister in Kent. If she chooses to go there, her fare is to be paid. Mrs. Ellison made the note. Yes, Your Grace. Arthur stood near the window, one shoulder against the frame. He had been silent through most of the discussion. Harriet had begun to understand that his silences were not empty. They watched. The second carriage may be sold, she continued. The bay gelding can be transferred to Redbourne. The grey mare should go to Winslow if there is room. Arthur's gaze sharpened at the ease with which she spoke of arrangements that would have occupied his steward for days. And your riding habit? He asked, contoured. You ordered it before the reception. Then the tailor may bless the timing. Mrs. Ellison hid the beginning of a smile. Harriet looked down the list again. No servant is to learn of dismissal through corridor gossip. We will speak to each one properly. Arthur said, there will be an additional month's wages for anyone we cannot place. Harriet turned toward him. Can we manage that? Yes. The answer came without hesitation. Too little hesitation, perhaps, for a man whose fortune had collapsed. Harriet felt the thought form and disliked herself for it. She had no figures before her, only his word and the knowledge that estates protected by entail could not simply be converted into ready money. Then it must be done, she said. Arthur watched her for another moment. You have made reductions to your own expenses before touching the servants. A gown does not have parents to support. Nor does a carriage require a character. Exactly. His mouth moved as if he might smile, but guilt passed over the expression first. Harriet closed the account book. I am going out this afternoon. Where? To inspect a house. Arthur straightened. For whom? For what remains necessary. She did not say more. He had told her the household must close within the week. Yet he had offered no clear plan for where they would live, once it did. If he meant to retire to Redbourne, he had not said so. If he meant to remain at his club while she stayed with relatives, he had not said that either. Harriet would not wait for uncertainty to decide the shape of her marriage. 14 Hatherby Street stood in a quiet Marylebone row of pale brick houses, respectable without pretending grandeur. Harriet arrived in a hired carriage with Bess beside her and the house agent waiting on the steps. The front room had 2 tall windows and enough light for a writing desk. The rear drawing room was smaller, with faded green paper and a grate that would not consume half a coal cellar in winter. Upstairs, one bedchamber faced the street. The other overlooked a narrow garden wall and a neighboring roof. The front room will serve as His Grace's study, Harriet said. The house agent blinked. His Grace will reside here, Your Grace. That is the intention. Of course. He opened his notebook quickly. And the larger bedchamber? Harriet looked at the proportions. For His Grace. Bess glanced at her. Harriet continued before the maid could object. The rear chamber will be mine. The agent led them through the kitchen, servant rooms, and small yard. The house could support a reduced staff, though not the full Redbourne establishment. Harriet counted beds, fireplaces, and steps between the kitchen and dining room. She asked the cost of coal delivery, the quarterly rate, and whether the water supply failed in summer. By the time they returned to the front room, the agent's surprise had turned to respect. The term is 3 months, Harriet asked. It may be renewed, Your Grace. The payment will come from income secured to my separate use under my marriage settlement. The agent hesitated. Shall the tenancy be recorded in Your Grace's name alone? No. Harriet took the paper he offered and read every line. The occupation memorandum must state, His Grace Arthur Dorrington, Duke Redbourne, and Her Grace Harriet Dorrington, Duchess of Redbourne. As joint residents? Yes. She added a written instruction beneath the memorandum. The first sentence stated that the house was intended for both Arthur and Harriet. The second stated that its expense must not exceed the income secured to Harriet's separate use. She signed beneath both lines. The agent retained the originals in his office file and gave Harriet an ordinary copy. Bess watched the papers disappear into Harriet's reticule. Your Grace, she said, once they were alone in the carriage. Are you certain? His Grace will come. Harriet looked through the glass at the Marylebone Street, receding behind them. No. Then why put his name first? Because I am not preparing to leave him. Harriet folded her gloved hands over the reticule. I am preparing to stay where he can afford to have me. Bess's eyes softened. And if keeping me becomes too much, then I will find you the best place in London and lie awake every night, resenting the woman who has you. Bess gave a small, startled laugh. Harriet smiled, but the answer had cost her. 7 years of service could not be reduced to a line in a household account. That evening, in a private parlour off Fleet Street, Lady Maud Dorrington placed a folded address before Neville Bristow. The editor of the Metropolitan Chronicle read it once, then again. Marylebone, he said. A duchess in a furnished house will sell better than a duchess in the country. You are not to print yet. Maud removed one grey glove finger by finger. Arthur still believes he controls the test. Bristow leaned back. And he does not. He controls the money. He does not control what society concludes when the money appears gone. You said the fortune remains intact. The title, estates, and capital remain safe. The distress is staged. Then why risk publication? Because Arthur will never admit he tested his wife. Pride will keep him silent. If Harriet leaves before he confesses, she loses. If she stays and society believes she means to preserve her own settlement, she still loses. Bristow tapped the address. You want a story ready before there is an event. I want language ready when an event can be made to look inevitable. He smiled without warmth. And what do I receive? Access. Political dinners. Names other editors do not hear until decisions are already made. Maud's gaze hardened. But the story waits until there is public discord. Bristow rang for a clerk. In the composing room above, a headline was set in heavy type. Duchess Deserts, Redbourne. One capital R came from a damaged case and was placed backward. The compositor noticed only after pulling a trial strip. Bristow marked the error and 2 changes in red pencil, then trimmed the strip and handed it to Maud. A premature prophecy, he said. A useful one, she replied. The address had come from a junior clerk in the house agent's office, a nervous young man whose brother wanted a political recommendation. He had copied Hatherby Street and part of Harriet's written instruction, though not the sentence declaring the house intended for both spouses. Maud folded the strip into her glove. Later, at Redbourne House, she removed that glove while crossing the service corridor after speaking with Arthur. The paper slipped soundlessly to the carpet. Bess found it several minutes later near the skirting board. She could read only part of Duchess and the ending of Redbourne. The red marks meant nothing to her. She carried it upstairs, placed it beneath the thread tray in her workbox, and closed the lid. Before midnight, Arthur informed Harriet that Redbourne House would close within 7 days. A smaller life had already been prepared for both of them. So had the lie that would call it desertion. By Friday morning, every servant in Redbourne House knew that someone would be leaving, though no one yet knew whose name had been placed nearest the edge of dismissal. The uncertainty had changed the sound of the house. Doors closed more carefully. Footsteps slowed outside occupied rooms. In the servants' hall, men and women who had spent years avoiding one another's eyes now watched the doorway together. Harriet entered beside Mrs. Ellison with the household account book beneath one arm. Arthur followed a moment later. Lady Maud came last and took a place near the wall, as though she had been invited to judge the proceedings. The long table had been cleared of breakfast things. A folded sheet lay before each senior servant, listing possible transfers, references, wages, and travel arrangements. Harriet noticed the youngest footman standing too straight. He had a mother in Dorset and no family connection powerful enough to find him another place quickly. She also noticed Mrs. Bell, the laundry-maid, with the widowed sister in Kent, twisting one corner of her apron until the fabric creased. Arthur stepped to the head of the table. "You have all heard enough rumor," he said. "You will now hear the truth of what concerns you." Harriet felt the word truth strike differently than it had 2 nights earlier. Arthur's voice did not falter. Redbourne House will close most of its London rooms within 5 days. The household must be reduced. No servant will be dismissed without full wages due, 1 additional month's wages, and a proper written character, where a place can be found at Redbourne, Winslow, or another Dorrington property. Mrs. Ellison and the Duchess will arrange it. Where travel is required, the house will bear the cost." The youngest footman lowered his head. Mrs. Bell stopped twisting her apron. Relief did not enter the room. It was too early for relief, but panic loosened enough for people to breathe. "Her Grace has reviewed every name," Arthur continued. "No decision will be made merely because one person is younger, poorer, or less connected than another. Service will be considered honestly." Lady Maud shifted against the wall. Harriet heard the silk of her sleeve brush the panelling. Mrs. Ellison began calling the senior servants forward one by one. The butler could remain until the house was secured, then transfer to Redbourne. 2 footmen would be offered country posts. One might prefer a London reference. The undercook would accompany Mrs. Pike to Marylebone if the smaller household required her. No one was promised certainty, but each person received an answer instead of a whisper. When Mrs. Bell came forward, Harriet said, "Your sister's address in Kent is in the account book. If you choose to go to her, your fare will be paid. If you prefer another London place, Mrs. Ellison will seek one." Mrs. Bell's eyes filled, though she kept her curtsy steady. "Thank you, Your Grace." "You have earned a choice," Harriet replied. Lady Maud waited until Mrs. Bell had returned to her place. "A generous phrase," she said, "though choices become fewer when a house can no longer afford sentiment." Several servants looked down. Harriet turned toward her. "Paying wages already earned is not sentiment." "No, but arranging comfort for everyone may be." "Then we shall arrange justice and allow comfort to take care of itself." Maud smiled faintly. "You speak as though you were born to ducal accounts rather than a more modest table." The insult was polished enough to pass as observation, but everyone in the room understood it. Harriet did not glance at Arthur. "A modest table teaches one to know what bread costs, and perhaps to return to it without complaint." Maud's gaze settled on Harriet's plain morning dress. "Have you decided when you will rejoin your Pritchard relations?" Silence travelled down the table. The question did not merely ask where Harriet would live. It declared before witnesses that her place beside Arthur could be revoked by poverty. Harriet rested one hand on the account book. A wife does not cease to be a wife because carpets are rolled up. "A title may remain," Maud said, "while a household discovers who truly belongs to it." Arthur moved before Harriet could answer. He did not raise his voice. "No one in House Dorrington will speak of the Duchess as though she were a temporary ornament." Maud's expression cooled. "I was discussing practical arrangements." "You were discussing my wife's place in her own household." Arthur faced the servants. "That place is not under examination." Harriet felt the force of the words and the hidden cruelty beneath them. His defense was everything a husband should offer publicly, yet somewhere below the steadiness of his tone lay the question he had never admitted asking. The servants heard protection. Harriet heard protection and something else. Arthur came to her side and offered his arm. He did not take her hand or assume she would accept. He simply waited. Harriet looked at the black sleeve, then at his face. The room watched without appearing to do so. She placed her gloved hand lightly on his arm. The gesture was formal, but warmth traveled through the point of contact. Arthur's posture changed almost imperceptibly, as if her choice had steadied him. "Mrs. Ellison," Harriet said, "continue with the placements. His Grace and I will review the remaining names this afternoon." "Yes, Your Grace." Arthur led Harriet from the servants' hall. At the corridor turn, where no one could see them except a passing maid who lowered her eyes, Harriet withdrew her hand. Arthur stopped. You should not have had to answer her. I did not mind answering. I minded hearing it. Harriet studied him. Public defence is not the same as private trust. The words landed cleanly. Arthur looked toward the high window at the end of the corridor. You believe I do not trust you. I believe you are measuring something. What? If I knew, I would not need to ask. Arthur could have ended the deception then. Instead, he said, you have managed this house better in 3 days than many women would in 3 months. That is praise, not an answer. It is true. So was your aunt's question. I have not told you where I intend to go. Do you intend to go somewhere without me? Harriet's eyes sharpened. You ask that as though the answer matters more than the fact you have not told me where you intend us to go. Arthur had no reply that did not expose him. Harriet inclined her head and walked toward the morning room, leaving him alone with the echo of his own question. On Saturday evening, they met again in the small library, where dust sheets covered half the shelves and packed crates narrowed the floor. Harriet had spent the day approving transfers. Arthur had spent it signing documents that protected obligations never truly endangered. A lamp burned between them. Harriet sat at the writing table with the ordinary copy of the Hatherby occupation papers sealed inside her reticule. Arthur stood beside the empty grate. If you could keep one thing from this house, he said, what would it be? Harriet looked up. One thing? Assume the absurdity of choosing. You first. The Gainsborough in the west drawing room. That is not one thing. It is also a declaration of vanity. Then the port, even less noble. A faint smile touched his mouth. My name. Harriet's expression changed. Your name cannot be packed. No, which is why it is useful. She reached to the edge of her hair, where the old tortoise-shell comb rested beneath the dark coils. I would keep this. Arthur looked at the worn comb. Because it was your mother's. Because it has served faithfully despite the missing tooth. A practical affection. The best kind. Harriet lowered her hand. I had hoped you might say your word. The smile left his face. My word. A name is what society calls a man. His word is what the people nearest him are permitted to trust. The lamp flame shifted. Arthur felt the signed memorandum as though it lay inside his coat, rather than in the solicitor's locked keeping. You think I have broken mine? I think there is something you have not given me. Harriet rose. I have found suitable lodging. For whom? For what remains necessary. That is what you said before. It remains true. Arthur took one step toward her, then stopped. Is there room for me? Harriet's breath caught, not because the question surprised her, but because it sounded almost vulnerable. There is room for the man who tells me why he comes. Silence settled around them. No servant entered, no door opened, no message arrived to save him. Arthur saw the path clearly. He could confess the false bank collapse, the staged calls, the test. He could tell Harriet that every choice she had made had already answered him. He could ask forgiveness before the deception reached deeper into the household. Instead, fear returned with the memory of his father's accounts and his mother's face at every creditor's knock. One more day, he told himself. One more proof freely given. I will tell you when I know, he said. Harriet looked at him for a long moment. Then I will show you the lodging, when I know whether you are coming as my husband or as the man who is still measuring me. She took her reticule and left. Arthur did not call her back. Later that night, Lady Maud sent a note to Neville Bristow, stating that separate addresses might soon be useful. In the quiet of the library, Arthur remained beside the empty grate and understood that he had chosen silence without interruption, excuse, or witness. On Sunday morning, Bess Tuckett asked the butler for a private audience with the Duke of Redbourne, and refused to explain why until the request had been carried upstairs in proper form. The butler regarded her with the grave suspicion reserved for servants who stepped beyond custom without first losing their senses. "His Grace is occupied," he said. "Then I'll wait. You understand that a lady's maid does not summon a duke. I'm not summoning him. I'm asking to be heard before silence does harm." That answer reached Arthur with the message. He received Bess in the small study beside the library, where half the books had already been packed and one wall stood bare except for the pale rectangles left by removed paintings. Bess entered, curtsied, and remained near the door. Arthur did not ask her to sit. The difference in rank made such familiarity impossible. But he dismissed his valet and closed the door himself. "You ask to speak privately?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Does the Duchess know you are here?" "No." Arthur's expression hardened. "If this concerns her household, you should not act against her wishes." "I don't know her wishes in this, Your Grace. I know only her honor." The words stopped him. Bess kept her hands folded at her waist. "I have no right to tell you what her Grace feels. I would not try. But there is something you have misunderstood, and if I let you continue misunderstanding it, I would be serving her gowns better than I serve her." Arthur studied her. "Go on." "The house in Hatherby Street was taken for both of you." He did not move. Bess continued before courage failed. "The occupation memorandum names His Grace Arthur Dorrington, Duke of Redbourne, and Her Grace Harriet Dorrington, Duchess of Redbourne, as joint residents." Her Grace had the agent put it plainly. Arthur's voice was very quiet. "You saw the document. I was present when it was prepared. What rooms did she choose?" Bess's eyes lifted, surprised by the question. "The front room for your study. It has the best morning light. The larger bedchamber for you. The smaller one for herself." Arthur looked toward the empty wall. "And your own position?" "Her Grace said she might have to reduce even me if keeping me made the household expense unjust." Bess swallowed. "I've served her 7 years. She would not say such a thing lightly." "Did she say why she did not tell me?" "She did not speak against you." "That was not my question." "No, Your Grace." Bess gathered herself. She wanted to bring you a completed choice, not another burden. She said she wasn't preparing to leave. She was preparing to stay where you could afford to have her. The room seemed to contract around the sentence. Arthur had imagined loyalty as something that announced itself under pressure. Harriet's had worked quietly through room measurements, servant beds, coal costs, and a legal instruction bearing both their names. She had not waited for him to offer security. She had built it for them while believing he had lost the means to do so. "Why tell me now?" he asked. "Because Her Grace thinks you're measuring her." Bess did not lower her eyes. "And because you asked whether there was room for you." "There is." Arthur felt the accusation without resenting it. "You understand that speaking without your mistress's permission may place you in difficulty." "Yes, you will not be punished for it." Relief passed across Bess's face, though she remained composed. "Nor dismissed," Arthur added. "Not by me, and not because you told me the truth." "Thank you, Your Grace," she curtsied. Her workbox remained upstairs in Harriet's dressing room, the unexplained printer's strip still hidden beneath the thread tray. Bess did not think of it. This conversation concerned what she understood, and she would not pretend knowledge she did not possess. When Arthur opened the study door, Lady Maud was crossing the passage. Her gaze moved from his face to Bess. "A private audience?" she asked. Bess curtsied and continued toward the servants' staircase. Maud watched her go. Since when does a lady's maid conduct business with the head of House Dorrington? Since the head of House Dorrington agreed to hear her, what did she want? You are not entitled to every honest conversation in this house. Maud's eyes narrowed. Honest? Yes. Then it was about Harriet. Arthur closed the study door behind him. You will not question Bess, dismiss her, or instruct another servant to report on her. You sound protective. I am becoming tired of your interest in my wife's servants. A household falls apart when servants forget the distance between loyalty and interference. This household has suffered more from the interference of rank. For the first time, Maud looked uncertain. Arthur left her standing in the passage. He found Harriet in the small morning room with Mrs. Ellison's transfer lists arranged across a writing table. Sunday light entered through uncovered windows, exposing the marks where heavy curtains had already been removed. Harriet looked up as he entered. Has something changed? Yes. Arthur closed the door, but did not approach immediately. Bess spoke to me. Harriet's face altered. About what? Hatherby Street. She set down her pencil. I did not send her. I know. Then she should not have been placed in the position of explaining my decisions. She placed herself there because she believed I had misunderstood you. Harriet's expression softened, despite herself. That sounds like Bess. She said the house is intended for both of us. It is. Arthur took one step nearer. You meant me to come. Harriet held his gaze. I meant us to go. The answer entered him with more force than any declaration society would have considered romantic. It held no performance, no plea, and no calculation. She had simply assumed marriage continued when comfort did not. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. You asked for whom the house was meant. I told you it was for what remained necessary. That was not an answer. Neither was anything you gave me. Arthur accepted the rebuke. Bess said you chose my study first. You require light for papers and have no patience with rooms that make you stoop. And the larger bedchamber. Your shoulders are broader than mine. Harriet. A faint smile touched her mouth and disappeared. I did not know whether you intended to come. I would not ask you to choose me while you were still deciding what you thought of me. Arthur stopped beside the table. The distance between them was small enough that he could see the fine strain beneath her composure. May I take your hand? He asked. Harriet looked at him carefully. The question itself mattered. He had offered his arm before servants, but this was private and deliberate. After a moment, she turned one hand palm upward on the table. Arthur placed his beneath it, rather than closing over hers. Harriet completed the gesture by setting her fingers into his. His hand was warm. Her own remained still, though her pulse moved visibly at her wrist. I should have trusted what I had already seen, he said. It was the nearest he had come to confession. Harriet's fingers tightened once. Trusted what? Arthur looked at their joined hands. The truth stood ready. The memorandum, the staged calls, Lady Maud's knowledge, the test that had already been answered beyond any honourable doubt. He raised his eyes to hers, that you would not make hardship an excuse for cruelty. Harriet searched his face. That is not the question you've been asking. Before Arthur could reply, the butler knocked and entered, carrying a folded newspaper on a salver. Forgive me, Your Grace. This was delivered with instruction that it be placed directly in your hand. Arthur released Harriet at once, not because he wished to, but because the sight of the Metropolitan Chronicle had turned the room cold. He took the paper. A short column appeared beneath the political notices. It reported that the Duchess of Redbourne had inspected private lodgings in Marylebone while her husband faced financial collapse. It did not claim she had separated from him. It asked whether prudent arrangements were being made for a distinct establishment. Harriet read over his shoulder. They know the address. Not printed here, but they know I inspected a house. Arthur's mind moved immediately to Maud. She knew the ruin was false. She knew enough of the household reduction to understand how damaging a separate address rumor could become. He also remembered her interest in Bess moments earlier. "I don't know the source yet," he said. Harriet stepped away from the table. "Is that the whole truth?" "It is the whole of what I know about this column." The qualification did not escape her. "Someone learned of Hatherby Street before you did." "Yes, someone chose to make that fact public before asking what it meant." "Yes. Can you stop a second report?" Arthur folded the paper. "I'll speak to Bristow and to the proprietors behind him. There will be no second item." Harriet looked at the hand that had held hers only moments before. "Do not merely silence it. What would you have me do? Find who gave them the address. Find what else was given with it. Then tell me everything that concerns me, even if you believe silence would be kinder." Arthur felt the demand reach far beyond the chronicle. "I will find the source. And the rest?" He could not promise without condemning himself. Yet refusing would answer her just as clearly. "I will tell you what must be told." Harriet's disappointment was quiet. That is still not the same thing. She gathered the transfer lists. "Will you come to Hatherby Street?" Arthur looked at the newspaper, then at the woman who had made room for him before he deserved it. "Yes, as my husband?" "Yes." Harriet gave one measured nod. She left the morning room carrying the lists. Arthur remained with the chronicle in his hand and the warmth of her fingers fading from his palm. He had been shown the truth by a maid, offered trust by his wife, and warned by the first printed lie. Still, the one deception capable of destroying them remained his own. On Monday morning, Redbourne House began to empty, with the solemn efficiency of a great ship being stripped before a storm. Curtains came down from rooms that had not been opened since winter. Paintings were wrapped in felt. Silver was counted, sealed, and carried to the vault. Mrs. Ellison supervised the servants who were transferring to Dorrington properties, while Harriet stood in the entrance hall with the final household list and made certain no name had vanished between promise and departure. By noon, the reduced London staff had been settled. Bess would remain with Harriet. Arthur's valet would remain with him. Mrs. Pike would serve as cook-housekeeper at Hatherby Street, assisted by one kitchen maid. A single footman would manage the door, table, and errands. The groom would accompany the last carriage to Marylebone. Then return to the country once the horses were placed elsewhere. It was not poverty. Harriet knew that. A family living on several £100s a year would have considered even this arrangement comfortable. Yet for a duke accustomed to a Mayfair household, measured in dozens, the reduction would be visible enough to satisfy every watching eye. Arthur's papers filled 2 locked cases and 3 ordinary boxes. Harriet's belongings occupied 4 trunks, 1 dressing case, and a writing box. Bess packed the old tortoiseshell comb in soft linen and placed it inside the dressing case. The printer's strip remained beneath the thread tray in her workbox, unnoticed and unexplained. The diamond Riviere stayed secured in the Redbourne vault. Harriet wore no jewels when she descended the steps. A hired carriage waited at the curb because the ducal vehicles were being sent away or stored. Several onlookers had gathered opposite the house, some pretending interest in a delivery cart, others making no effort to hide their curiosity. Arthur came down, carrying a narrow case of private papers. One gentleman near the railings glanced at the hired carriage and laughed softly to his companion. Redbourne has fallen beneath his servants. Arthur stopped. Harriet felt the tension travel through the footman beside her. Arthur turned just enough to make the speaker realize he had been heard. "Honest service has never stood beneath me," he said. "I recommend the principle to anyone uncertain of his own position." The gentleman flushed. A few people nearby laughed, though not at Arthur. Harriet looked at her husband with an unwilling warmth. He had defended the dignity of servants as quickly as he had defended hers. The inconsistency remained. So did the feeling. Arthur offered his hand to help her into the carriage. The gesture was formal and public. Harriet accepted, because refusing would turn their departure into another spectacle. His fingers closed around hers only long enough to steady her. He released her as soon as she was seated. Bess entered beside Harriet, while Arthur sat opposite. The journey from Mayfair to Marylebone passed through streets that grew less ceremonious with every turn. Redbourne House had seemed built to remind its occupants what they represented. Hatherby Street appeared designed to remind them where they had placed the coal scuttle. When the carriage stopped before number 14, Arthur looked up at the pale brick front and narrow windows. Harriet waited for the smallest sign of distaste. None came. "The ceilings are lower than Redbourne," he observed. "You'll be forced to notice them. A dangerous reform. You may find several." His eyes met hers. "I already have." The answer held enough meaning that Harriet looked away first. Inside, the front study had been prepared with a plain desk, 2 bookcases, and a worn leather chair. Arthur set down his papers and examined the morning light falling across the writing surface. "You chose this room. Bess has been generous with information. She said only that it had the best light." Harriet removed her gloves. "You become cross when print is dim. I become discerning. You require spectacles. That accusation is more ruinous than the bank." She almost laughed. The sound escaped before she could prevent it. Arthur smiled fully, and for one moment the house seemed to contract around something easy and private. The room did not ask either of them to perform rank. It permitted only presence. Mrs. Pike served luncheon in the small dining room, where the table could seat 6 if everyone was prepared to know one another's opinions. Harriet reviewed the cost of coal, candles, bread, meat, and laundry. Arthur listened with the attention he usually reserved for parliamentary figures. "You know the price of every candle in the house," he said. "Someone should. At Redbourne, I never learned what a candle cost. That is because 40 servants made certain you never saw one end. And here you'll learn not to leave 3 burning while you read 1 page. This household is tyrannical. It is solvent." The word landed differently between them. Arthur's smile faded, though Harriet could not know why. The fortune remained intact. Only his claim of ruin gave her thrift its urgency. He looked down at the account sheet. "You have made this place possible without asking anything from me. I asked you to come. You prepared before you knew I would. I prepared because I knew what I would do." Arthur raised his eyes. "Stay." Harriet held his gaze. "Yes." The answer was simple. It should have ended his test. Instead, it deepened his shame. Later, on the narrow staircase, Arthur stepped back to let Harriet pass. The space was so confined that her shoulder came within an inch of his chest. He could have placed a hand at her waist as a husband might. He did not. He turned slightly and gave her the full width of the stair. Harriet paused one step above him. A duke yielding passage in his own house. Your house, he said. Our house, according to Bess. Then it appears I am yielding in partnership. Your first useful reform. His eyes warmed. I fear there may be more. Harriet continued upward, aware of his nearness, without having been touched. The restraint affected her more than contact might have done. By Wednesday, the household had begun to find its rhythm. Arthur worked in the front study. Harriet managed correspondence in the rear drawing-room. They shared breakfast without a dozen servants entering and leaving. They met unexpectedly on the stairs and in the narrow hall. Every ordinary encounter revealed something their grand marriage had concealed. Arthur liked his tea stronger than Redbourne's butler had ever allowed. Harriet read political speeches when she could not sleep. He disliked lilies indoors. She disliked doors left ajar. At dinner, they disagreed about whether a cracked serving dish should be replaced. Arthur said dignity required a whole plate. Harriet said gravy concealed philosophy. He laughed again, and the sound followed her upstairs after the meal. Lady Maud arrived that afternoon without waiting for an invitation. She entered the drawing-room, looked at the faded wallpaper, the modest fire, and the two chairs pulled near the window. Arthur's papers occupied one side table. Harriet's sewing basket stood on the other. Nothing in the room suggested separate lives. "You are comfortable," Maud said. Harriet heard the disappointment beneath the observation. Comfort is less expensive when it is not designed to impress witnesses. Maud turned to Arthur. "And you work here? My study is at the front. The Duchess arranged it." She did. His answer held quiet pride. Maud saw it. Harriet saw Maud see it. "A reduced household may feel charming for a week," Maud said. "Novelty often disguises strain. Then we shall become uninteresting," Harriet replied. Arthur's mouth curved. Maud remained only 15 minutes. She asked no direct question about the Chronicle column, but her gaze moved once toward the street, as though measuring how easily the house could be watched. After she left, Harriet said, "Your aunt dislikes the curtains." "My aunt dislikes any room she did not arrange." She seemed more troubled by the occupants. Arthur looked toward the closed door. "She has managed my public life for many years. And now I am learning that management and loyalty are not always the same thing." Harriet wanted to ask what else he was learning. She did not. At dusk, Bess went downstairs to receive a parcel from the dressmaker. Through the narrow front window, she saw a man standing beside the house agent near the corner. The agent's posture was stiff. The other man held a folded copy of the Metropolitan Chronicle beneath his arm. Bess could not hear the conversation, but she saw the agent shake his head and point toward his office as though refusing to discuss the house in the street. The reporter wrote something in a small notebook before walking away. Upstairs, Harriet and Arthur sat across from each other at the small dining table, arguing lightly over whether one lamp was sufficient. Neither knew that Lady Maud had already told Bristow the modest house was failing to separate them. Neither knew that the story would now require a public wound. On Thursday morning, Lady Densmore's note arrived before breakfast and contained only 3 lines, each more troubling than the last. The Metropolitan Chronicle was preparing a second item concerning the Redbourne household. It would mention 14 Hatherby Street. It would not be kind. Harriet read the note twice at the small dining table while Arthur stood by the window, fastening one cuff. The morning light fell across the plain room. the mended edge of the carpet, and the account book Harriet had left beside her plate. For 3 days, Hatherby Street had begun to feel almost safe. The warning entered that safety like cold air beneath a door. "How does Lady Densmore know?" Arthur asked. "Her brother dined with one of the Chronicle's proprietors." Harriet handed him the note. He heard enough to warn her, but not enough to know the wording. Arthur read it without visible alarm. "There will be no second item. You said that after the first. Then I will be more effective this time." He crossed to the front study, and within an hour, 2 letters had left the house. One went to Neville Bristow. The other went to a senior proprietor whose ambitions had once depended upon Arthur's support in Parliament. Arthur wrote with the clipped precision of a man accustomed to making doors open before he reached them. Harriet stood at the study entrance while he sealed the second letter. "What did you say?" she asked. "That the paper is preparing to publish private domestic information without verification. And if that does not persuade them, I reminded the proprietor that political access is granted by men who value discretion." Harriet looked at the seal cooling beneath his hand. "So the article will be stopped because you can frighten them. It will be stopped because it is false. Those are not the same reason." Arthur set the letter aside. "Does the distinction matter if the lie never reaches print?" "It matters if someone already possesses the truth and chooses silence because you are powerful." His gaze sharpened. "What would you have me do? Invite Bristow into this room and explain our marriage?" "No. I would have you discover who gave him the address and why he believes our life belongs to him. I am doing that. You are suppressing the result before finding the source. I am protecting you." Harriet stepped farther into the study. His papers occupied every shelf she had chosen for him. Her arrangement had made room for his work. His secrecy still made no room for her. "Protection without truth is only another room with the door locked," she said. Arthur's expression changed, not with anger, but recognition. "You think I have locked you out. I think someone knows enough about us to prepare a second story, and you still speak as if the danger begins at Fleet Street." Arthur did not answer. Harriet saw the refusal forming before he chose it. She turned away. "Tell me when your influence has purchased silence," she said. "I would rather know when you have found the truth." By noon, the Chronicle had agreed to delay publication pending verification. Arthur presented the news without triumph. Harriet received it without gratitude. The item had not appeared, but neither had its source. The rest of the day passed beneath a tension too quiet for the servants to name. Arthur worked in the front study. Harriet reviewed household expenses in the rear drawing room. They met only at dinner, where Mrs. Pike served mutton, potatoes, and a pudding modest enough to satisfy Harriet, and rich enough to offend none of Arthur's remaining expectations. Their conversation remained civil. It did not become easy. After the servants withdrew that evening, Harriet entered the small drawing room and found Arthur standing before the fire with one hand on the mantel. The room held 1 lamp, 2 chairs, and a sofa too narrow to permit dignified distance. He had removed his coat and wore only his waistcoat over the white shirt, a degree of informality Redbourne House would never have allowed before midnight. Harriet sat at one end of the sofa. "You said the article was delayed," she began, "not withdrawn." "No," and Bristow did not name his source. He denied that any source had been used, which means he lied. "Yes." Arthur remained standing. Harriet watched the fire settle. "Why does the thought of my leaving trouble you more than the fact someone is preparing the story before I have done it." He looked at her. "Because I have seen departure disguised as prudence." "Whose?" The question held him still. For several seconds, Harriet thought he would refuse again. Then Arthur crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite her. His posture remained controlled, but his hands no longer did. He clasped them once, released them, and looked down. "My father's household appeared prosperous until I was 19, he said. "He entertained, subscribed, purchased horses, and promised improvements. He also concealed debts beneath loans and loans beneath expectations. When the truth emerged, every man who had praised his judgment claimed he had always suspected it." Harriet listened without interruption. Arthur's voice lowered. "My mother knew before I did. Not the figures, the fear. She heard every knock at the door as a demand. She began looking at my father as if she could no longer tell which part of their life had been real." The fire cast a shifting shadow across his face. "I learned to manage what people saw before I learned to trust what they felt." "And when you cannot trust it?" Harriet asked. "I look for proof." The answer was too honest to be harmless. "Even from your wife?" Arthur raised his eyes. Shame entered them before he could hide it, especially from the person whose leaving would matter most. Harriet's anger changed shape, but did not disappear. "Fear may explain why a man builds a locked door. It does not give him the right to ask his wife to live behind it." Arthur absorbed the sentence in silence. "I know what my mother's face became," he said after a moment. "I am afraid that one day you will look at me as she looked at him, as if every room I gave you had been arranged to conceal something." Harriet's breath tightened. He had never spoken to her with such nakedness. Not in their courtship, not on their wedding day, not in 6 months of marriage. "Then do not conceal it," she said. Arthur looked at her as though the answer were both simple and impossible. "The evenings here have been different," he said. "Different how?" "At Redbourne House, I could mistake ceremony for marriage. Here, I know when you have moved my papers because the inkstand faces the correct direction. I know you read political speeches after midnight. I know you count candles and still leave one outside my study when I work late." Harriet's mouth softened despite herself. "You would walk into the door without it." "That is possible. Probable." The faintest smile appeared between them. It vanished when Arthur added, "These have been the first evenings in which I have felt present in my own life." Harriet looked at him. "They were the first evenings in which you seemed present to me." The room became very still. Arthur lowered one hand to the space between his chair and the sofa. He turned the palm upward and left it there. He did not ask. He did not reach. Harriet understood the offer. She also understood how much remained unsaid. After a long moment, she placed her hand in his. Arthur's fingers closed lightly. Harriet turned her palm upward and interlaced their fingers. The touch was warmer than the fire and quieter than apology. They remained joined without speaking. Arthur's thumb moved once along the side of her hand. "I have come to depend upon your steadiness," he said. "Dependence is not trust, no, nor is vulnerability the same as truth." His grip did not tighten, no. Harriet searched his face. "Are you still waiting for proof from me?" Arthur inhaled. The confession stood close enough that she saw it enter his expression. No servant knocked. No newspaper arrived. No carriage stopped outside. He had every opportunity. "I am not ready to answer that," he said. The pain of the choice was sharper because nothing had prevented him. Harriet looked down at their joined hands. "Then you are asking me to comfort the fear that keeps me outside your confidence." "I know." "Do you?" She withdrew her fingers slowly. Arthur let her go. He did not try to reclaim her hand. "I will not punish you for being afraid," Harriet said, "but I will not call fear honesty because it has finally spoken in a softer voice." Arthur bowed his head once. "That is fair. No, it is necessary." The next morning, a sealed invitation arrived for Covent Garden on Monday evening. Lady Densmore had arranged a box and suggested that the Duke and Duchess appearing together might quiet speculation. Arthur showed Harriet the card. We could refuse. Harriet thought of the delayed article, the unseen source, and the people already deciding what her silence meant. "No," she said, "we will go together." Across London, Neville Bristow inspected the completed handbill. Beneath the headline accusing the Duchess of desertion, one sentence quoted the phrase, "income secured to her, separate use." The sentence immediately before it, the one declaring 14 Hatherby Street, intended for both Arthur and Harriet, had been omitted. Bristow marked the final line in red pencil. The damaged capital R remained reversed. On Monday evening, the 17th of May, Arthur offered Harriet his arm beneath the lamps at Covent Garden, as though the choice itself could silence everything written about them. Carriages crowded the entrance. Silk skirts swept over the paving stones. Gentlemen paused beneath the portico with the careful inattention of people determined not to appear curious. The Duke and Duchess of Redbourne had not been seen together in public since moving to Hatherby Street. Their arrival became news before they reached the doors. "We can still leave," Arthur said quietly. Harriet looked toward the bright foyer beyond the glass. That would allow everyone else to decide why. "You shouldn't have to endure an evening arranged around speculation. I'm not afraid of a room I have every right to enter." Arthur inclined his head. "Then we enter together." Harriet placed her gloved hand on his sleeve. The contact was formal, nothing like the interlaced fingers they had shared the night before. Yet Arthur felt the difference. She had withdrawn from his hand when he refused to answer whether he was still seeking proof. Now she accepted only the public gesture required by the occasion. Inside, chandeliers burned above the grand staircase. A countess expressed concern for Harriet's delicate situation with such sweetness that every word carried poison. A political acquaintance asked Arthur whether enforced economy might prove a useful education for the aristocracy. Arthur answered with dry restraint and kept Harriet beside him. For the first half of the performance, the appearance of unity held. During the interval, they entered the foyer among a tide of patrons. Lady Densmore greeted Harriet warmly and spoke of the music instead of the chronicle. Harriet had just accepted a glass of water when a boy pushed through the crowd carrying freshly printed handbills. Another appeared near the stairs. A third lifted a bundle beside the entrance. "Metropolitan Chronicle special notice," one cried. "The Redbourne separation." The word reached Harriet before the paper did. Conversation thinned. Fans slowed. Arthur took a handbill from a gentleman who had unfolded it too eagerly. Across the top stood the words, "Duchess deserts." The ringed Redbourne, the capital R in Redbourne, leaned backward like a letter reflected in a mirror. Beneath it, the article claimed Harriet had secured 14 Hatherby Street before creditors could reach ducal property. It said she intended to preserve income secured to her separate use while leaving Arthur to bear disgrace alone. It mentioned her cancelled gowns, the hired carriage, the reduced servants, and her visit to the house agent before Arthur had seen the property. Every decent choice had been rearranged into proof of selfishness. Harriet read the quoted phrase twice. That came from my written instruction, she said. Arthur's eyes lifted sharply. Who saw it? The house agent, his clerk, perhaps. Bess was present when the memorandum was prepared, but I don't know whether she saw the exact wording. Arthur reached inside his coat and drew out a folded note delivered to him before they left Hatherby Street. He had not shown it to Harriet. Bristow's hand carried only one sentence. The account came from within Hatherby Street, and the language is the Duchess's own. Harriet saw the note. You received this before we came? An hour ago, and you said nothing. I did not know whether it was true. You knew it came from Bristow. Yes, then you knew it was meant to divide us. Arthur looked again at the phrase. He knew the occupation memorandum named them both. He knew Harriet had chosen his study and intended him to come, but the wording on the handbill appeared to come from a private instruction, and Bristow had claimed the source was inside their present home. Fear moved faster than reason. Did you authorize any statement after the first article? He asked. Harriet stared at him. No. Did you speak to Bristow? No. Did Bess, the houseant? I haven't asked him. The wording is exact, yes, which means someone copied it. It does not mean I gave it to them. Several political patrons stood close enough to hear. Lady Densmore watched from beside a marble column. A member of Parliament lowered his handbill but did not look away. Arthur felt the old pressure of public judgment close around him. His father's creditors had once watched him with the same satisfaction, waiting for dignity to crack. He knew the evidence before him proved nothing against Harriet. He also knew that every person in the foyer expected him to declare what he believed. We should leave, he said. Together? Harriet asked. Arthur looked at the crowd, then at Bristow's note. Until I know who released the wording, it may be wiser if we leave separately. The sentence was calm, almost reasonable. Then he removed his arm from beneath her hand. The movement was slight. The room understood it at once. Fans stopped. Two gentlemen stepped apart to give Arthur space, as though he had already separated himself from his wife. The printed lie had claimed Harriet deserted him. Arthur's withdrawal gave the accusation a living image. Harriet looked at the empty place where his sleeve had been. Pain rose so quickly that her breath caught, but she refused to let the room see more than stillness. You know the house was taken for both of us, she said. Yes. You know I prepared a study for you before I chose my own room. Yes. You know the phrase has been removed from the sentence that explained its purpose. Arthur's eyes moved back to the handbill. He knew she was right. Harriet, I need time to discover who spoke. And while you discover it, you have chosen to show society that you doubt me. I am trying to prevent further damage. You are making the damage visible. His jaw tightened. Don't turn this into something it is not. I haven't turned anything into anything. Her voice remained low. That is what others have done to me. You have simply chosen to stand with their version until it is convenient to return to mine. Arthur flinched. I'll send the carriage for you. No, you cannot leave alone. Bess is here. Harriet handed her untouched glass to a passing footman. I will not sit in your carriage while you decide whether your wife deserves to share it. That isn't what I said. It is what you showed them. She turned before her composure could fail. Bess, waiting near the retiring room, saw Harriet's expression and came at once. Arthur took one step after them, then stopped. He could have followed. He could have stood beside Harriet and declared that the joint memorandum mattered more than Bristow's insinuation. Instead, he remained beneath the chandeliers, watched by the men whose opinion he had chosen to fear. A hired carriage carried Harriet and Bess to Marylebone through streets damp from a brief shower. Harriet sat upright with both hands clasped in her lap. Only once did Bess speak. "Your Grace." His Grace knew the house was for both of you. Yes. Then why would he think you gave the paper that story? Harriet watched the lamps slide over the wet glass, because when reputation asked him whom to trust, he answered with doubt. At Hatherby Street, Harriet had barely removed her cloak when Arthur's carriage stopped outside. The footman returned from the door. "His Grace asks to speak with you." Harriet received him in the narrow hall, but did not invite him farther. His face had lost its public composure. "Harriet, let me explain." "You may explain after you have decided which truth you withheld before tonight." "I should not have asked us to leave separately." "No, you should not have made our marriage another exhibit for the foyer." "Where would you have me go?" he asked. "Redbourne House or your club." She kept several feet between them. "Hatherby Street was chosen for us. Tonight, I need it to belong to the truth." Arthur lowered his head once. He left without touching her. Upstairs, Bess removed the pins from Harriet's hair. The old tortoiseshell comb came free and lay beside the mirror, one tooth missing, holding nothing now. Harriet stared at it until Bess's hands stopped. "There was something I found before we moved," Bess said. She crossed to her workbox, lifted the thread tray, and drew out the trimmed strip she had kept since Redbourne House. Harriet turned. Bess placed it beside the handbill. The same reversed capital R appeared on both. The smaller strip also carried Bristow's red pencil marks. Harriet aligned the papers carefully. "Where did you find this?" "In the service corridor after Lady Maud had been there. I didn't know what it meant." Harriet looked at the prepared word, then at the article claiming to report an event that had not yet occurred when the strip was made. Grief sharpened into purpose. "They did not report a desertion," she said. "They prepared one." She folded neither paper. She placed them flat in the dressing table drawer. "Tomorrow we find the printer. At 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning, the 18th of May, Harriet placed the printer's strip and the Covent Garden handbill side by side on the drawing-room table at 14 Hatherby Street and asked the Dorrington family solicitor to look at them without touching either one. Bess stood near the mantel, her hands clasped tightly enough to whiten the knuckles. She had slept little. Harriet had not slept at all. The solicitor bent over the two papers. The reversed capital R appeared in both. Red pencil marks crossed the smaller strip. "You found this at Redbourne House?" he asked Bess. "Yes, sir." "Where exactly?" "In the service corridor near the private parlour." "When?" "Before we moved to Hatherby Street. Lady Maud had passed through the corridor not long before." "Did you see her drop it?" "No." Bess looked toward Harriet, then forced herself to continue. "I saw her leave the private parlour. Later I found the paper near the skirting board." "Why did you keep it?" "It carried part of Her Grace's title and part of Redbourne. I thought it might concern the household." "Did you understand what it was?" "No, sir." "Where did you place it?" "Beneath the thread tray in my workbox." "And it remained there until last night." The solicitor straightened. "Who handled it between the time you found it and the time you showed it to the Duchess?" "No one." "Did you unfold, trim, mark, or alter it?" "No." Harriet watched him record every answer. "You will write down the place, the approximate hour, and the order of events," he said. "Use your own words. Do not improve them for dignity." Bess's mouth tightened. "I wouldn't know how, sir." The solicitor looked almost pleased. "Good." He asked Harriet to describe the handbill she had taken from Covent Garden and where it had been kept after her return. Harriet explained that she had placed both papers flat inside the dressing-table drawer and had not folded or marked either one. When the account was complete, the solicitor lifted the trial strip with clean paper, placed it inside a stout envelope, and sealed it with plain wax. The handbill went into a second envelope and received a separate seal. "From this moment, both remain in my keeping," he said. "If either envelope is opened, the occasion and witnesses will be recorded." Harriet nodded. "They are not to return to me without record." "Agreed." The act was quiet. It changed everything. The papers were no longer scraps found by a maid and carried home by a humiliated wife. They had become a sequence no one could rearrange without leaving a mark. "We go to Fleet Street," Harriet said. The solicitor closed his notebook. "The Chronicle may refuse you entry. Then its refusal will be noted. Mr. Bristow may accuse you of attempting to intimidate his staff. I will ask questions, not issue threats." He studied her for a moment. Very well. Harriet wore a dark walking dress and no ornament beyond her wedding ring. Bess accompanied her. The solicitor sat opposite them in the hired carriage, the sealed envelopes secured inside his document case. As they travelled from Marylebone toward Fleet Street, the city grew louder and narrower. Messengers hurried through the traffic, carrying folded sheets. Carts waited outside newspaper offices with bundles of damp paper. The air smelled of coal smoke, horse sweat, ink, and hot machinery. Harriet had crossed Fleet Street many times, but never with the knowledge that a lie could travel from one composing room into a theatre foyer before the truth had even understood itself. The Metropolitan Chronicle occupied a narrow building with the latest edition displayed in its front window. One of the Covent Garden handbills had been pinned beside the door. Harriet looked at the backward R and felt pain harden into purpose. Inside, a clerk attempted to send them away until the solicitor gave his name and Harriet gave hers. A message disappeared upstairs. Neville Bristow did not come down. Instead, the press foreman received them in a cramped room off the composing floor. He was broad through the shoulders, with ink beneath his nails and the guarded expression of a man who had learned that powerful people often called pressure a question. "Mr. Bristow is not available," he said. "I am not asking for him," Harriet replied. "I am asking about production." The foreman glanced at the solicitor's case. "I cannot discuss editorial matters. Then we shall not discuss opinion." The solicitor broke the seal on the first envelope and held the strip where the foreman could see it without surrendering possession. The man's eyes changed before his face did, Harriet noticed. "Did this strip come from the Metropolitan Chronicle?" she asked. "It resembles our work. That is not my question." The foreman looked toward the closed door. Machinery thudded above them in a steady rhythm. "Yes," he said, "it came from this building." Bess released a breath so quietly that only Harriet heard it. "Does the reversed capital R identify a damaged piece of type?" Harriet asked. "There is a damaged sort in one of the composing cases." "Whose case?" "Mr. Bristow's room uses it most often." "And the red pencil marks?" The foreman looked at the strip again. "Mr. Bristow marks proofs in red. Most of the other editors use black or blue." "When was this headline first set?" "I cannot answer that without the proof schedule." "Then bring the schedule." "I will not release records without the senior publisher's authority." "I did not ask you to release them. I asked you to preserve them." The foreman met her eyes. "They are preserved. The assignment ledger as well?" His hesitation gave her the answer before he spoke. "Yes." And the damaged sort? Yes, Harriet did not press farther. The date mattered, but forcing a frightened employee into a statement he could later be made to deny would weaken everything. I am not offering money, she said, nor a position, nor influence. Keep the records where they are. If the proprietors call for them, produce only what exists. The foreman's suspicion eased by a fraction. I can do that. A junior clerk entered, carrying a fresh proof. He stopped when he saw Harriet and tried to hide the sheet beneath a ledger. The foreman held out his hand. Give it here. The clerk obeyed. Across the top appeared Lady Maud Dorrington's name. Beneath it, a short statement expressed concern that an over-familiar maid had invented a sentimental account of the Duchess's loyalty in order to secure favor and advancement. Bess read enough to understand. Her face drained of color, but she remained upright. Harriet took one step closer to the foreman. Has that gone to press? Not yet. Preserve it. Your Grace, I cannot take instructions from you. Then take notice from me. If it vanishes after this visit, the disappearance will become part of the record. The foreman folded the proof once and placed it inside a drawer. It will remain. The outer door opened behind them. Arthur entered alone. His valet stopped in the passage and did not follow. For one suspended moment, Harriet and Arthur looked at one another across the cramped room. The last time she had seen him, she had ordered him out of the house chosen for them. Now he stood within a building where strangers had prepared her abandonment before he had publicly performed it. I will not interrupt your inquiry, he said. The words were directed to Harriet, not the solicitor. He turned to the foreman. Bess Tuckett remains in the Duchess's service. No statement implying dismissal, disgrace, or disfavor is to be accepted as coming from House Dorrington. The foreman glanced at the page in the drawer. Arthur continued. Her words belong to her. They are not to be rewritten in my name. Bess curtsied. Thank you, Your Grace. Harriet's expression did not soften. Protecting her employment matters, she said. It will matter more when you stop protecting me from the truth. Arthur absorbed the sentence without defense. I know. Do you? Enough to ask rather than presume. He kept the distance between them. Will you receive me on Saturday? Harriet looked at the sealed envelopes, the hostile proof, and the man who had chosen public doubt when she had asked for trust. For what purpose? To tell you what I should have told you before Covent Garden. At Hatherby Street? Only if you permit it. The press machinery continued above them. Harriet let the silence test him. He did not approach. He did not offer his hand. Saturday at 2, she said. You will wait to be admitted. Yes. From Wednesday through Friday, the solicitor examined the Chronicle's ownership, instructed the house agent to preserve the original tenancy papers and Harriet's written direction, and sent formal notice that production records concerning the Redbourne handbill must not be destroyed. Arthur returned to Redbourne House and prepared an authenticated copy of the memorandum dated the 4th of May. Neville Bristow ordered his staff to release no schedule, ledger, or proof without the senior publisher's authority. By Friday night, Harriet knew the strip had come from Bristow's composing room. She still did not know when it had been set, how Lady Maud had obtained it, or what truth Arthur intended to bring to her door the following afternoon. At 2 minutes before 2 on Saturday afternoon, the 22nd of May, Arthur Dorrington stood on the pavement outside 14 Hatherby Street, with a sealed leather folder in one hand, and waited until the church clock began to strike before he raised the brass knocker. Harriet watched from the drawing-room window. He had come without his carriage, without his valet, and without any visible claim to precedence beyond the quality of his dark coat. For the first time since their marriage, the Duke of Redbourne looked like a man who understood that a closed door might remain closed. Harriet stepped back before he could see her. "His Grace is waiting," Bess said from the hall. "Let the footman admit him when the clock has finished," Harriet replied, "and stay within call." "Yes, Your Grace." Arthur entered only after he was announced. He bowed and stopped several feet inside the drawing-room. Harriet stood beside the mantel in grey silk, wearing her wedding ring and no other ornament. The old tortoise-shell comb remained upstairs in her dressing case. The room contained no softened light, flowers, or domestic work that might disguise the purpose of the meeting. "Thank you for receiving me," Arthur said. "You asked to tell me what should have been said before Covent Garden." "Yes." "Then sit." Arthur waited until Harriet had taken the chair near the window before choosing the one opposite. He placed the leather folder on the small table between them. "The document inside is an authenticated copy," he said. "The sealed original remains with the family solicitor." Harriet looked at the folder. "What does it prove?" "That I deceived you." Arthur opened the clasp and drew out a memorandum dated the 4th of May. Harriet recognized his hand before he placed the page within her reach. The memorandum recorded that the reported banking collapse had not destroyed the Duke of Redbourne's capital. It instructed the solicitor to preserve every lawful obligation, protect contracted wages, and maintain the appearance of financial ruin until Arthur ordered otherwise. The paper did not tremble. Harriet's fingers did. "The bank did not ruin you," she said. "No. The speculative calls did not destroy your liquid fortune. No, the title, estates, household, and servants were never in the danger you described." Arthur's face tightened. "The fortune was not. The fear was. Because you made it so." "Yes." Harriet read the document again, though the words had already fixed themselves in her mind. "Why?" Arthur did not reach for his father's history or the fear he had described while holding her hand. "Because I wanted to know whether you would remain if comfort disappeared." The answer was quiet enough to be more brutal. Harriet lifted her eyes. "You tested me." "Yes, like a servant whose honesty is measured by leaving silver within reach." "Yes. Did Lady Maud know from the first evening?" "The solicitor, he knew the loss was false and that every obligation was protected. He did not know what my aunt would do with the information." "Did Bess know?" "No." "Mrs. Ellison?" "No." "Any of the servants?" "No." Harriet looked toward the closed door, beyond which Bess waited, still believing that the fortune had vanished and only the newspaper's interpretation had been false. Then every frightened face in that servants' hall was real. Yes. Mrs. Ellison believed she had failed a house she served for more than 20 years. Young servants wondered whether they would leave without references. Bess thought I might dismiss her, because affection had become an expense. You knew all of that, while knowing the cause was invented. I told myself their wages were protected. Harriet's voice sharpened. Wages do not prevent fear. I know. You know now. Arthur accepted the correction. Yes. Harriet placed the memorandum on the table. I chose this house because I believed you had lost almost everything. I counted fireplaces. I calculated coal. I chose your study before I chose my room. I prepared to send Bess away if keeping her made our reduced household unjust to others. Arthur's gaze lowered. I know. You knew before we moved. Bess told me on Sunday. And you continued. Yes. Harriet rose and walked to the window because sitting beneath his gaze had become impossible. Hatherby Street moved beyond the glass in ordinary Saturday rhythm. A boy carried bread beneath a cloth. A woman shook a rug from an upper window. None of them knew that a duchess had just discovered the poverty in which she had proved her loyalty had never existed. "Why did you not stop when Bess told you?" Harriet asked. Arthur remained seated. "Because ending the deception would have required me to admit what I had done." Then the first Chronicle column appeared. I told myself confession would deepen the scandal, expose the household, and make every sacrifice seem foolish. I called the delay prudence. It was cowardice. Harriet turned. "And at Covent Garden?" "The phrase from your written instruction frightened me." Bristow's note said the account came from within Hatherby Street. I knew the occupation memorandum named us both. I knew you had intended me to come. I also knew the quoted words were yours. "So you believed him?" "Not completely. That makes it worse." Arthur did not flinch from the judgment. "Yes." Harriet returned to the table. "You knew his evidence was insufficient, yet you chose public distance because political men were watching." "Yes." "You removed your arm after knowing I had chosen you in hardship." "Yes." "You let the room believe I had deserted you because you feared being made foolish." Arthur's voice lowered. "Yes." Harriet pressed one hand to the back of the empty chair. "You turned our marriage into an examination I did not agree to take. Then, when I passed it, you distrusted the answer." Arthur looked at her without defense. "There is no kinder description of what I did. Do not offer me kindness. Offer accuracy." Then accurately, I created the insecurity I claimed to fear. I used your peace and confidence in our marriage to answer a question I was too afraid to ask. I gave Lady Maud the foundation for a lie. At Covent Garden, I placed my reputation above the truth I already knew about you. The room fell silent. Harriet had wanted confession. She had not expected it to leave so little shelter for anger. His honesty did not mend the injury. It prevented him from hiding inside it. "What do you intend to do?" she asked. Arthur drew a second paper from the folder. "Publish the truth under my name. The fortune was never lost. You were not informed. Bess was not informed. The servants believed the danger was real. I will state that my withdrawal from you at Covent Garden was unjust, and that the newspaper's accusation grew from a deception of my making." Harriet read the opening lines, but did not take the page. "Where will it appear?" "Wherever the lie appeared. That is my first condition." Arthur waited. "Your confession must be printed with equal prominence in the Chronicle and sent to any paper that repeats the handbill. It is not to be reduced to a private letter or softened by political friends." "Agreed." "Second, Bess speaks in her own words. No secretary improves them. No solicitor makes them respectable." "Agreed." "Third, I write my own public statement. You will not decide what a duchess may safely say about her own humiliation." "Agreed." Harriet took one measured breath. "Fourth, you will keep separate rooms. You will call upon me formally, wait to be received, and remain at whatever distance I choose until I choose otherwise. My wedding ring does not give you leave to enter any room, touch me, or resume the privileges of marriage before trust returns." Pain moved across Arthur's face, but he did not bargain. "Agreed. You understand that trust may not return?" "Yes." "And you will still publish?" "Yes." Arthur closed the folder. "If you wish, I will leave Hatherby Street permanently. You chose it. I have no right to make it another place where you feel watched." Harriet looked around the modest room, at the faded curtains and the narrow space where they had once held hands through a long silence. "This house was chosen for us," she said. "You have not yet earned the right to call it home." Arthur bowed his head. I understand. He rose, but did not approach her. I will not ask you to forgive me. Good. I will do what truth requires, even if forgiveness never follows. Harriet said nothing. Arthur left without offering his hand. When the front door closed, Bess entered slowly. Harriet gave her the authenticated memorandum. The fortune was never lost, she said. Bess read only enough to understand before looking up in disbelief. His Grace tested me. Lady Maud knew. The servants did not. Bess's fingers tightened around the paper. What happens now? Now the truth is placed where the lie was. Before dusk, Arthur's signed confession reached the offices of the Metropolitan Chronicle. Neville Bristow read it once, folded it with care, and told the messenger that the paper would not print a duke's private remorse as public fact. By Saturday morning, the 29th of May, the lie had acquired so many papers that Harriet feared the truth might be buried beneath them, unless each document was made to answer only one question. During the 6 days since Arthur's confession, the family solicitor had gathered the original Hatherby Street papers, written to the senior proprietor of the Metropolitan Chronicle, and warned the press foreman that no schedule, ledger, proof, or damaged piece of type was to be destroyed. Arthur had sent copies of his signed statement to the solicitor, and to the proprietor Bristow had ignored. Harriet had written her own account, in a hand so controlled that Bess, reading the first page, had said nothing for several minutes. At 10 o'clock, the house agent arrived at 14 Hatherby Street, carrying a flat document case. Arthur came separately and waited in the hall until Harriet permitted the footman to admit him. The family solicitor sat at the drawing-room table with his notebook open. Bess remained near the window. Arthur chose a chair several feet from Harriet and did not move it closer. The house agent placed the occupation memorandum before the solicitor. Its wording was formal and unmistakable. His Grace Arthur Dorrington, Duke of Redbourne, and Her Grace Harriet Dorrington, Duchess of Redbourne, were named as the intended residents of 14 Hatherby Street. Beneath it lay Harriet's written instruction. She recognized her own hand at once. The first sentence stated that the house was intended for both Arthur and herself. The second stated that its expense must not exceed the income secured to her separate use. The Chronicle had printed only the second. Arthur read the two sentences together and went still. Bristow removed the explanation, he said. Someone gave him enough to remove it, Harriet replied. The agent cleared his throat. I believe I know who. He produced an office entry and a short written admission signed by a junior clerk. The young man had copied the address and the second sentence for Lady Maud after she promised to secure a political recommendation for his brother. He had not copied the first sentence because Maud told him it was irrelevant. Did you dismiss him? Arthur asked. The question carried more force than the room required. The agent tightened his grip on his hat. He has been suspended, Your Grace. Suspended? Arthur leaned forward. He betrayed a client's confidence for favor. Harriet saw the agent's shoulders draw inward. Arthur. He did not appear to hear her. Did Lady Maud pay him? No, Your Grace. She promised influence. And you allowed him access to private instructions? Arthur. Harriet crossed the small space and placed 2 fingers against the back of his hand. The touch was light, deliberate, and brief. Arthur stopped speaking at once. He looked down at her fingers, then at the house agent's face. Harriet withdrew her hand. We need his memory, she said, not his fear. Shame passed through Arthur's expression. He turned back to the agent. You are right to preserve the record. I was wrong to question you as though you had committed the breach yourself. The agent blinked. Thank you, Your Grace. Arthur's voice changed. What did the clerk say Lady Maud intended to do with the wording? He did not know. He believed she wanted proof that her Grace had taken a house using her own settlement. Did he speak to a reporter later? Harriet asked. No. The man who approached me in the street was from the Chronicle. I refused him. The clerk had already supplied the address through Lady Maud. The solicitor recorded the answer. The originals remain with you until Monday, he said. You will bring them to the Chronicle at 5 in the morning. I will. When the agent had gone, Arthur looked at the written instruction once more. At Covent Garden, I knew the quoted phrase could not prove desertion. Harriet met his eyes. Yes. I saw it removed from its context and still allowed fear to choose for me. Yes. He did not ask her to soften the judgment. That mattered. By 2 o'clock, Harriet, Bess, Arthur, and the solicitor had reached the Chronicle's composing rooms. The press foreman received them. With the guarded courtesy of a man who knew his employment had become part of an aristocratic war he had never chosen, the solicitor opened the sealed envelope containing the printer's strip, recorded the witnesses, and held the proof where the foreman could compare it with. The composing case, the damaged capital R, matched the reversed letter. Bristow's red corrections matched the markings on other proofs preserved in the office. You confirmed the strip came from this building, Harriet said. Now I need the date. The foreman brought forward a proof schedule and an assignment ledger. He placed them on the table without surrendering either. The first setting was ordered on the 7th of May. Bess looked at Harriet. That was before we moved. 2 days before, His Grace learned the house was intended for both of you, the solicitor said, and 10 days before Covent Garden. The foreman nodded. A young compositor waited beside the type cases, cap in hand. He had set the headline. Mr. Bristow gave you the wording? The solicitor asked. Yes, sir. Did he say the Duchess had left her husband? No, sir. What did he say? The young man glanced toward Arthur and faltered. Answer plainly, Arthur said. The command struck the room with more force than he intended. The compositor stepped back. Harriet did not touch Arthur this time. She only looked at him. Arthur saw the fear he had created and corrected himself. Forgive me, he said to the young man. You are not accused. Tell us what conditions would allow you to speak, without believing your livelihood depends upon pleasing me. The compositor's grip loosened on his cap. I want the senior proprietor present. Mr. Bristow can dismiss me. If I speak while he controls the room, I may not work in Fleet Street again. Arthur looked to the foreman. Can the records remain secured until the proprietor arrives? Yes. Then no promise will be made beyond what we can keep. You will speak before the senior proprietor, and Mr. Bristow will not be permitted to question you alone beforehand. The compositor nodded. What did he say when he ordered the headline? Harriet asked. The young man looked at her. He said the Duchess would leave sooner or later. He wanted the words held ready so the public would understand the event quickly when it came. Did he mention Lady Maud? No, but I carried the first proof downstairs. A lady was waiting in his private room. Bess spoke from beside Harriet. Lady Maud returned to Redbourne House with that strip. I saw her leave the private parlour before I found it. The solicitor recorded the statement, then resealed the trial strip in its envelope. The foreman retained the damaged type, proof schedule, assignment ledger, and Bristow's marked corrections. No evidence left the Chronicle except what had arrived in the solicitor's case. the senior proprietor agreed by messenger to attend a formal hearing at 5 o'clock on Monday morning, the 31st of May. Arthur requested that 3 political subscribers, whose names Bristow had repeatedly used to strengthen the Chronicle's authority, be present. The proprietor sent messengers before dusk. Outside the composing room, Arthur stopped 1 step below Harriet on the narrow staircase, leaving the passage clear. "May I call tomorrow?" he asked. "For what purpose?" "To show you the final confession before it is read publicly and answer whatever you ask." 1 hour, Harriet said, at 3. "I will wait to be admitted." She inclined her head. It was not forgiveness. It was permission earned by one corrected action at a time. From an upper office, Neville Bristow watched them leave. Before the ink on the proprietor's summons had dried, he ordered a second edition. Prepared for 4:30 on Monday morning, 30 minutes before the formal hearing. This time the headline used an undamaged R. On Sunday afternoon, the 30th of May, Lady Maud Dorrington arrived at 14 Hatherby Street 20 minutes before Arthur's permitted call and expected the front door to open for her, as it had opened at Redbourne House for years. The footman hesitated, but Harriet heard the knocker from the drawing-room and said, "Show her in." Bess stood near the window with a folded length of ribbon in her hands. Since the false ruin had been exposed, fear had left her face and been replaced by a steadiness. Harriet trusted more than polished courage. Lady Maud entered in dark plum silk, removed her gloves slowly, and looked around the modest room, as though it had personally offended House Dorrington. Her gaze settled on Bess. "This is a family matter." Harriet remained seated. Bess became part of it when you attacked her for telling the truth. A maid does not become family because she mistakes loyalty for influence. "No," Harriet said. "She becomes a witness when people of rank assume no one beneath them will remember." Maud sat without invitation. "Then let us be practical. Neville Bristow is prepared to print a correction." Bess's fingers tightened around the ribbon. Harriet asked, "What will it correct?" "The Chronicle will state that your removal to Hatherby Street may have been misunderstood and was not intended as a permanent separation." "Will it state that the headline was prepared before any separation occurred?" "No newspaper exposes every error in its private process." "Will it state that Arthur's fortune was never lost?" Maud's mouth hardened. "Certainly not." "Then it is not a correction. It is enough to quiet society without destroying your husband's standing." Harriet folded her hands in her lap. "What is the price?" Maud looked again at Bess. "Dismiss the maid. Return to Redbourne House. Leave political dinners, household appointments, and public arrangements to those who understand them. The absurd test remains private. In return, Bristow softens the story and allows the matter to die." The room grew very quiet. Bess lowered her eyes, but Harriet saw the color leave her face. "You want me to dismiss the woman who preserved what you dropped," Harriet said. "I want you to understand that a servant who places herself between husband and wife becomes dangerous." "Bess did not place herself between us. Arthur did that when he tested me. You widened the distance when you prepared my desertion in type." Maud's composure thinned. "You speak as though you can survive this without him. I can survive dishonesty without accepting it. Society will believe a duke before it believes a maid." Harriet's voice remained calm. "The duke is preparing to tell the same truth as the maid." The brass knocker sounded again. The mantel clock marked 3. Harriet did not call out. The footman entered a moment later. "His Grace is waiting in the hall." Lady Maud stared at her. Waiting, he asked permission to call. Harriet turned to the footman. His Grace may enter. Arthur stepped into the room carrying a leather case. He saw Maud, then Bess, then Harriet. Surprise did not change his purpose. He bowed to Harriet. "Thank you for receiving me." Maud rose. "Arthur, this has gone far enough. Tell your wife to dismiss that woman and return home before Bristow's next edition makes all of you ridiculous." Arthur did not look at Bess as though she were a problem to be removed. "Harriet is not the disorder in this room. Do not answer me with clever phrases. Control your household. You no longer control mine." The words were quiet. Maud went still. Arthur placed the leather case on the table, but kept his distance from Harriet. "My signed confession has been copied to the senior proprietor of the Metropolitan Chronicle and to the family solicitor. It states that the loss was false, that Harriet knew nothing of it, that Bess knew nothing of it, that the household fear was real, and that my conduct at Covent Garden was unjust. You cannot print that. I can. You will destroy your standing." Then my standing was built, too cheaply. Maud's breath shortened. "You would sacrifice years of influence for a wife's wounded pride and a servant's account?" "No, I will sacrifice concealment because I created the conditions your lie required." Arthur faced her fully. "Bess will not be dismissed. Her words will not be rewritten. You will no longer arrange invitations, dinners, appointments, or political business in my name. You will not reside in any Dorrington house unless Harriet invites you. You would exile your own aunt for trying to protect you. You did not protect me. You protected your place." Maud's face lost colour. Arthur continued. "You believed Harriet would replace you in the household. You believed I would never admit the test because confession would shame me. You intended to force her departure before I chose between my wife and your authority." Maud's eyes moved to Harriet. "And you approve this performance?" Harriet met her gaze. "He did not ask me to approve it. That is one reason I believe he may finally understand." The answer struck harder than triumph. Maud gathered her gloves. "You will both regret allowing sentiment to govern rank." Arthur stepped aside from the door. "I regret allowing fear to govern marriage." Lady Maud left without another word. The front door closed below with a force the small house could not hide. Bess remained near the window until Harriet looked at her. "Please give us the room, Bess. Stay within call." Bess curtsied and left. Arthur did not move closer. "The statement," he said. "You asked to review it." Harriet opened the leather case. The confession was written in Arthur's hand and copied cleanly for publication. He named his own deception before naming Maud or Bristow. He wrote that Harriet had acted in good faith, that Hatherby Street had been chosen for both of them, and that his public withdrawal had lent authority to a falsehood. He did not call himself misguided, protective, or wounded. Harriet reached the final sentence and looked up. "You have not asked the proprietor to shorten this. No. You have not asked your political friends to protect your name. No. You understand society may remember your cruelty longer than my humiliation. It should." His answer held no self-pity. Harriet closed the statement. "Why did you come before it was printed?" "Because I promised to answer every question, and because there is one truth I will not place before strangers before I say it to you." His control faltered, but he did not approach. "I love you. I loved you while I was still trying to measure what should only have been trusted. I loved you in this house before I had earned the right to call it ours. I love you enough now to accept that you may choose never to live with me again." Harriet's breath caught. The words did not erase Covent Garden. They did not restore the hand he had withdrawn before witnesses. Yet he offered them, without demand, without touching her, and without using love to escape consequence. "You would accept a permanent, separate residence?" she asked. Pain moved across his face. "If that is your choice. And still publish?" "Yes." "And still protect Bess's right to speak?" "Yes." Harriet stood. Arthur remained where he was. She crossed the room slowly and stopped before him. "Trust is not restored. I know. The truth must stand in print before our marriage can stand in public again. It will." Harriet closed the remaining distance and put her arms around him. Arthur did not immediately embrace her. He waited until her hold tightened, until the choice was unmistakable. Then his arms came around her with careful strength. Harriet rested her forehead against his shoulder and felt one unsteady breath leave him. The embrace held apology, longing, and restraint. It did not pretend the wound had vanished. When Harriet lifted her face, Arthur loosened his hold instead of assuming more. "May I kiss you?" he asked. Harriet looked into the eyes that had once measured her and now waited for an answer. "Yes." She rose slightly and met him halfway. His kiss was warm, restrained, and brief, more promise than claim. When they separated, Arthur did not draw her back. Harriet kept one hand against his coat. "Tomorrow we finish it. Together, if you permit me." "Beside me," she said, "not before me." A hurried knock sounded. Bess entered, carrying a folded message from the press foreman. "Your Grace, Mr. Bristow has moved the second edition to 4:30 tomorrow morning. The formal hearing is at 5. Arthur reached for the message, but stopped before taking it from Bess. Harriet read it first. The tenderness in the room hardened into resolve. "Send word to the senior proprietor and every witness," she said. "We leave at 4. At 4:04, on Monday morning, the 31st of May, Harriet entered the Metropolitan Chronicle's printing room beside Arthur, not behind him. Bess and the family solicitor followed. The house agent arrived, carrying the original Hatherby Street papers in a flat document case. Gas lamps burned above rows of type and iron machinery. The air smelled of coal smoke, hot metal, ink, and damp paper. Compositors stood away from their cases, uncertain whether to continue setting the second edition. At the far end of the room, Neville Bristow waited beside a locked form of type prepared for the press. The foreman and the young compositor stood near the senior proprietor, who had received Arthur's message before dawn. 2 political subscribers were already present. A third entered moments later, fastening his coat as he crossed the floor. Lady Maud had not yet arrived. "This is an editorial workplace," Bristow said. "It is not a ducal drawing room. Your Grace cannot enter and dictate what the public is permitted to know." Arthur removed his gloves. "I have not come to dictate what the public may know. I have come to prevent you from printing what you know to be false." Bristow looked toward Harriet. "The Duchess has persuaded you that every unflattering conclusion is a conspiracy." Arthur did not take the invitation to defend himself by accusing someone else. "My wife did not create the circumstances that made your story believable. I did." The senior proprietor nodded toward the papers in Arthur's hand, then read your statement. The machinery behind them remained silent, but the building seemed to hold the force of its interrupted motion. Arthur faced the room. "On the 4th of May, I informed the Duchess of Redbourne that a banking failure and speculative calls had destroyed most of my liquid fortune. That statement was false." A murmur moved among the subscribers. Arthur continued. "I arranged the appearance of ruin to discover whether my wife would remain with me under reduced circumstances. She did not know. Her maid did not know. The servants and tradespeople did not know. Their fear was real, though the financial danger was not. Bristow's expression tightened. The Duchess responded by protecting wages, cancelling her own expenses, and securing a modest house for both of us. At Covent Garden, when your handbill accused her of desertion, I withdrew my arm and asked that we leave separately. I knew she had intended Hatherby Street as our joint home. My conduct was unjust. It gave the authority of my rank and marriage to a falsehood. He lowered the page. No defense of Harriet can be honest unless my deception is stated first. The senior proprietor turned to Bristow. You received this confession? I received the private remorse of a husband under pressure. You refused to print it, Arthur said. Because remorse is not proof. Harriet stepped forward. Then let us establish proof. She did not look at Arthur for permission. I leased 14 Hatherby Street because I believed my husband had lost his fortune. I chose the front room for his study and the larger bedchamber for him. I directed the agent to record us as joint residents. The house agent opened his case and placed the occupation memorandum before the proprietor. The full legal styling was clear. His Grace Arthur Dorrington, Duke of Redbourne, and Her Grace Harriet Dorrington, Duchess of Redbourne. No request for separate residence was made. The agent said, "The original has remained in my office since it was executed." He then produced Harriet's written instruction. The first sentence states that the house was intended for both spouses. The second says the expense must not exceed the income secured to Her Grace's separate use. Harriet looked at Bristow. Your handbill printed the second sentence and omitted the first. Bristow glanced at the document. Editors shorten material every day. You did not shorten it, Harriet said. You removed the meaning that contradicted your accusation. The house agent produced the junior clerk's signed admission. A clerk copied the address and the second sentence for Lady Maud Dorrington. After she promised a political recommendation for his brother, he did not give the information to Her Grace, her maid, or anyone within Hatherby Street. Arthur's jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt. Harriet turned to Bess. Do you consent to speak here? Bess's hands were clasped, but her voice remained steady. Yes, Your Grace. And do you consent to your name being used in the correction? Yes, provided my words aren't changed. They will not be, Harriet said. Bess faced the proprietor. Her Grace chose His Grace's study first, because it had the best morning light. She planned to reduce even my position if keeping me made the household expense unjust. She told me she wasn't preparing to leave him. She was preparing to stay where he could afford to have her. Bristow gave a thin laugh, a sentimental account from a dependent servant. There is more, Bess said. The family solicitor placed 2 sealed envelopes on the table and recorded the witnesses before opening them. From the first, he removed the trimmed printer's strip. From the second, Harriet's retained Covent Garden handbill. The same reversed capital R appeared on both. Bristow's red pencil marks crossed the strip. I found that proof in the service corridor at Redbourne House. Bess continued. Lady Maud had passed through after meeting a gentleman. I kept it because it carried part of Her Grace's title and part of Redbourne. I did not understand it until the handbill appeared. The foreman stepped forward with the damaged capital R, the proof, schedule, the assignment ledger, and preserved examples of Bristow's red corrections. The first setting was ordered on the 7th of May, he said, before the Duke and Duchess moved to Hatherby Street. 10 days before Covent Garden. The young compositor removed his cap. Mr. Bristow gave me the wording. He said the Duchess would leave sooner or later and that the headline should be held ready. You are dismissed, Bristow said. The senior proprietor turned sharply. You no longer possess that authority while I am present. Bristow's face changed. Advance notices are common. Newspapers prepare for events before they occur. Harriet looked directly at him. A death notice may be prepared because death comes to everyone. A report of desertion cannot honestly be prepared before the wife deserts. Why did you print the conclusion before the act you claimed to report? Bristow glanced toward the locked form of type. He had no answer that did not reveal Lady Maud's part. The door opened before he could invent one. Lady Maud entered in a dark travelling cloak, breathless from haste and pale with anger. Because I warned him, she said. I knew what Harriet would do when comfort ended. Harriet's voice remained level. You did not predict a departure. You arranged one in type. I protected Arthur from humiliation. Arthur faced his aunt. You used my dishonesty to manufacture my wife's. Maud looked toward the subscribers. You all understand what is at stake. If this confession is printed, Redbourne's judgment becomes a public scandal. One subscriber folded the handbill in his hand. His judgment is already part of the scandal, Lady Maud. Concealing it would make the rest of us participants. Another man said, you used political access to obtain private household information. You will no longer arrange any gathering attended under my patronage. The third inclined his head, nor mine. Maud's authority, built through invitations, introductions, and quiet obligations, vanished without raised voices. The senior proprietor turned to the foreman. Open the form. Halt the second edition. Bristow stepped forward. You cannot suspend publication on the word of a servant and an apologetic duke. I relieve you of the direction of this paper until the proprietors meet, the senior proprietor replied. The next edition will carry the Duke's confession, the Duchess's statement, and a formal retraction with equal prominence. Mrs. Tuckett's testimony will be acknowledged by name because she has granted permission. The solicitor closed his notebook. Civil proceedings for libel will begin today. The strip, handbill, schedule, ledger, tenancy papers, written instruction, clerk's admission, and false ruin memorandum will remain preserved. Arthur looked at Lady Maud. You will no longer reside in or act for any Dorrington household. You will arrange no invitation, appointment, or political business in my name. Maud's eyes moved to Harriet. You have turned him against his own blood. Harriet answered, No, I required him to stand beside the truth. Lady Maud left without another word. No one applauded. Harriet would not have accepted it. She looked toward the compositors, waiting beside the idle machinery. The men who set the false edition acted under instruction. They should not lose wages because Mr. Bristow misused their work. The proprietor nodded. They will be paid. The false form was unlocked. Type was lifted, sorted, and reset. Arthur's confession, Harriet's statement, and the retraction took its place. When the press began again, its rhythm filled the building like a great mechanical heartbeat. After the witnesses dispersed, Arthur remained several feet from Harriet. Do you wish me to return to Hatherby Street? He asked. Harriet looked at the man who had tested her, doubted her, and finally exposed himself before asking anyone else to believe her. She crossed the distance and took his hand. I love you, she said. Arthur's breath caught. I loved the man you might become before you trusted me. I love the man who has chosen truth now, but I will continue to judge that choice by how you live. His fingers closed around hers without tightening. I love you. Harriet rose and kissed him, briefly and freely, while the corrected edition began its journey into London. By Thursday, the 15th of July, London had found fresher scandals to discuss, but the consequences of the Redbourne deception had not vanished. With the last bundle of corrected newspapers, the Metropolitan Chronicle had printed Arthur's confession in full, Harriet's statement without alteration, and a formal retraction with equal prominence to the accusation. Neville Bristow had been removed from the direction of the paper by its proprietors. The civil proceedings for libel continued at the measured pace of law, supported by the trial strip, the Covent Garden handbill, the proof schedule, the assignment ledger, the damaged capital R, Harriet's written instruction, the house agent's original records, the junior clerk's admission, and Arthur's memorandum of the 4th of May. Lady Maud Dorrington had gone to Bath. No Dorrington carriage had carried her there, and no invitation issued from Redbourne House bore her influence. 6.5 weeks had passed since the presses of Fleet Street began carrying the truth through London. During that time, Arthur had not once treated public vindication as private forgiveness. The first week after the hearing, he sent Harriet a household notice concerning a political dinner at Redbourne House. In former months, the notice would have been copied and delivered before she saw it. This time, the draft arrived at 14 Hatherby Street, beneath a short note in Arthur's hand. Nothing had been issued. Nothing would be issued until she approved the wording and the guest list. Harriet altered 3 names, removed Lady Maud's former secretary, and added the senior proprietor who had stopped Bristow's 2nd edition. Arthur accepted every change without question. On another afternoon, he came to Hatherby Street, carrying financial statements, and sent up his card like any gentleman seeking an audience. Harriet watched from the upstairs window as he waited on the pavement while the footman carried his name into the house. He did not use his title to shorten the delay. He did not raise the knocker twice. When Harriet admitted him, he answered each question about investments, loans, settlements, and household obligations without hiding behind a solicitor's language. Separate rooms remained in place. Meals were shared only when Harriet invited him. No servant's name appeared in a public statement unless that servant had first been consulted and had granted permission. Arthur kept every condition without reminding Harriet that he had kept it. That mattered more than apology repeated. On the morning of the 15th, Harriet sat across from him at the small Hatherby Street dining table, while sunlight reached through the front windows and caught the edge of the renewed tenancy papers. The formal wording named His Grace Arthur Dorrington, Duke of Redbourne, and Her Grace Harriet Dorrington, Duchess of Redbourne, as joint occupants for another year. Arthur looked from the document to the narrow room, where one corner of the wallpaper had begun to lift in the summer warmth. A duke and duchess renewing a furnished house in Marylebone, he said. Society will assume we've developed a taste for rebellion. Harriet poured tea. Society has survived what more serious disappointments. And Redbourne House? We use it for official dinners, political duties, and any occasion large enough to require a staircase people can descend while pretending not to watch one another. Arthur's mouth curved, a precise architectural requirement. Hatherby Street remains private. No uninvited political callers, no newspaper men, no relative assumes control of the drawing room because she once chose the curtains. A harsh constitution. You may appeal to the Duchess. I have heard she is difficult. Harriet met his eyes. Only with husbands who test their wives. The humour faded, but Arthur did not ask her to spare him. I expect to deserve that answer for a long time. Yes. Then I will learn to hear it without asking you to make it easier. Harriet looked down at the papers. That response, more than any protest of devotion, showed how far he had travelled from the man who had managed appearance before trust. Arthur drew a folded list from his coat. There is another matter. The gowns you cancelled may be reordered. The Riviere remains secured at Redbourne House, but any ornament or expense you surrendered can be restored. Harriet set down her cup. No gowns, no restitution through display. Arthur waited. He had learned not to fill every silence. Every servant and worker affected by the staged retrenchment receives an additional month's wages. Harriet said, not charity, compensation for fear you created. Arthur did not answer that all contractual wages had already been paid. He took out a pencil and wrote beneath the list, Mrs. Ellison will verify every name, including temporary servants and tradesmen who believed the accounts might fail, including them, and the junior servants who were transferred rather than dismissed. Yes. Harriet watched him. Right. Bess's increase entered last week. She will remain your lady's maid and supervise the training of a junior maid in both houses. She is not to become a curiosity for grateful society. She has already refused 3 invitations to recount Fleet Street over tea. Harriet's brows lifted. What did she say? That anyone wishing to hear the truth could purchase the corrected edition. Harriet smiled. Very sensible. That evening, Redbourne House opened for a small supper. It was not a triumphant return arranged for applause. 12 guests had been invited, all chosen by Harriet and Arthur together. Lady Densmore would attend. So would the senior proprietor of the Chronicle. The press foreman had declined with polite firmness, saying he preferred the composing room to a ducal dining table. Arthur had accepted the refusal without sending another invitation. In the Duchess's dressing room, Bess fastened the final hook of Harriet's pale silver gown, while the junior maid folded a shawl nearby. The diamond Riviere remained in its case. Harriet wore small pearl drops and her wedding ring. On the dressing table lay the old tortoise-shell comb, polished but unchanged. Its missing tooth remained exactly as it had been when Harriet's mother owned it. "The comb, Your Grace?" Bess asked. "Yes." Bess placed it carefully into Harriet's hair. The worn teeth caught and held. The junior maid watched with frank curiosity. "Couldn't the missing tooth be replaced?" she asked, then flushed. "Forgive me, Your Grace." Harriet met Bess's eyes in the mirror. It has never needed to be perfect to hold. Bess's expression softened. A knock sounded at the outer door. Not an entrance, a request. Bess crossed the room and opened it. Arthur stood in the doorway wearing evening black and a white cravat. He did not step across the threshold. "Her Grace is nearly ready," Bess said. Harriet turned on the dressing stool. Arthur's gaze found her in the mirror first, then directly. There was warmth in his face, but no assumption. "May I come in?" he asked. 6 weeks earlier, he had stood outside Hatherby Street, waiting to confess that he had turned their marriage into a test. Now he waited outside his wife's dressing room, because he had learned that love did not abolish doors. Harriet rose and held out her hand. "You may come in." Arthur crossed the threshold and took the hand she offered. His fingers closed gently, leaving no pressure she had not chosen. Bess guided the junior maid from the room and left the door partly open behind them. Arthur looked at the comb in Harriet's hair. "Your mother's. Still unfashionable, still faithful. Better qualities for a marriage than brilliance. Once, The words might have driven him into defense. Now he nodded. I intend to remember that. Harriet stepped nearer. I love you, Arthur. His breath altered, though he had heard the words before. This time they belonged not to the aftermath of battle, but to an ordinary room and a future deliberately chosen. I love you, he said. He did not ask whether the past had been forgiven forever. He did not promise never to feel fear again. Instead, he waited until Harriet leaned toward him. Then he pressed a quiet kiss to her temple. She rested her shoulder against his chest. Only after she settled there did his arm come around her. Below, the first carriage arrived. We should go down, Harriet said. Together, Arthur asked. Harriet looked toward the open door. Together. They left the dressing room hand in hand. The old comb caught the lamplight in Harriet's hair, holding firm despite the missing tooth, while the door behind them remained open.